Late rent often starts with a detail people overlook. A familiar what happens if rent is late example is when a tenant misses the due date because salary arrives 2 days later. The lease may define a grace period or treat the rent as late immediately. A small timing gap can become a fee if the rule is strict. People often feel pressure around what happens if rent is late before they can explain where it came from. The situation is easier to judge when a small timing gap can become a fee if the rule is strict is treated as a likely effect, not a mystery. Late rent becomes clearer in a concrete situation. In what happens if rent is late, the real-world version may be that a landlord sends a reminder instead of starting formal action. Early communication may solve a temporary mistake. Silence can make the situation feel more serious. This is the detail that changes what to check next in what happens if rent is late. A person who catches this early can respond before silence can make the situation feel more serious becomes harder to reverse. Late rent changes the decision before anyone names it. It shows up in small moments, such as when a late fee appears on the account ledger. Fees are usually controlled by the lease and local rules. Tenants should check whether the charge matches the agreement. Noticing that driver early can keep what happens if rent is late from becoming harder to manage. For what happens if rent is late, the real sequence matters more than the most dramatic detail. Late rent has a cost that appears later. Look at a case where a partial payment is made before the full rent is available. Some landlords accept it while still recording a balance. The account may remain delinquent even after money changes hands. The headline alone does not show the whole chain behind what happens if rent is late. That difference matters because the account may remain delinquent even after money changes hands is often where the pain or cost is felt. Late rent depends on timing as much as facts. A concrete version is when a tenant promises to pay next week without writing anything down. Verbal plans are easy to misunderstand under stress. A short written payment plan gives both sides a clearer record. The background force should guide the next decision in what happens if rent is late more than the first reaction. The situation is easier to judge when a short written payment plan gives both sides a clearer record is treated as a likely effect, not a mystery. Late rent can look simple from outside. In a normal day, automatic payment fails because a card expired. Technology reduces effort but does not remove responsibility. Checking failed transactions quickly can prevent extra charges. In what happens if rent is late, the clearer reading follows the cause instead of stopping at the visible result. A person who catches this early can respond before checking failed transactions quickly can prevent extra charges becomes harder to reverse. Late rent creates pressure in ordinary life. Picture the situation where roommates depend on one person to collect everyone's share. One missing roommate payment can make the whole rent late. Shared housing needs internal records and deadlines. The moment becomes easier to handle when the moving part is named clearly in what happens if rent is late. For what happens if rent is late, the real sequence matters more than the most dramatic detail. Late rent is shaped by rules and incentives. The clearest version is when the landlord issues a formal notice. Notices usually start a legal timeline rather than end the matter instantly. Responding fast matters more than hoping it disappears. That mechanism explains why the topic affects real choices in what happens if rent is late. That difference matters because responding fast matters more than hoping it disappears is often where the pain or cost is felt. Late rent becomes risky when assumptions replace evidence. In what happens if rent is late, someone may notice that a tenant avoids the landlord out of embarrassment. Avoidance removes the chance to negotiate or correct an error. Shame can make a manageable problem harder. Seeing the cause early gives people more room to respond well in what happens if rent is late. The situation is easier to judge when shame can make a manageable problem harder is treated as a likely effect, not a mystery. Late rent is easier to handle when the moving parts are visible. Watch what happens when a repeated late pattern develops over several months. Landlords may see reliability risk even when rent eventually arrives. Future renewals or references can be affected. In what happens if rent is late, the visible event can distract from the driver that needs attention. A person who catches this early can respond before future renewals or references can be affected becomes harder to reverse. Late rent has both a visible side and a quieter side. What happens if rent is late becomes concrete when bank processing delays move money slower than expected. The payment date and received date may not be treated the same. Tenants should know the rule before relying on last-minute transfers. When what happens if rent is late appears in real life, this is the detail to check first. For what happens if rent is late, the real sequence matters more than the most dramatic detail. Late rent can turn small choices into larger consequences. For example, a tenant uses the security deposit as the last month rent without approval. Deposits are usually separate from rent obligations. Using them early can create a new dispute. In what happens if rent is late, this is the point where the visible choice and the real pressure start to meet. That difference matters because using them early can create a new dispute is often where the pain or cost is felt. Late rent rewards preparation more than guessing. In real life, maintenance complaints are mixed with non-payment. A renter may feel justified withholding rent after ignored repairs. Local law may require specific steps before withholding is safe. That is why what happens if rent is late should be read through facts rather than a quick assumption. The situation is easier to judge when local law may require specific steps before withholding is safe as treated as a likely effect, not a mystery. Late rent can be misunderstood when people focus on one number. Think about how the landlord has mortgage or expense obligations. Late rent may affect cash flow for repairs, loans, or building costs. The issue is not only personal conflict. For what happens if rent is late, the important move is to notice the chain from first signal to final effect. A person who catches this early can respond before the issue is not only personal conflict becomes harder to reverse. Late rent affects trust because expectations are involved. A simple what happens if rent is late case is this. A one-time emergency creates a shortfall. Medical bills or job loss can disrupt an otherwise reliable payment history. Evidence and communication can help separate crisis from neglect. That sequence explains why what happens if rent is late can grow even when the first moment looks small. For what happens if rent is late, the real sequence matters more than the most dramatic detail. Late rent works differently for different people. What happens if rent is late appears when late rent affects future rental applications. Some landlords ask for payment history or references. A documented pattern can follow the tenant. The early sign matters in what happens if rent is late because it can change cost, trust, timing, or emotional meaning. That difference matters because a documented pattern can follow the tenant is often where the pain or cost is felt. Late rent should be checked before money or emotion is committed. One ordinary what happens if rent is late version is that a payment plan spreads the balance across several dates. Clear dates and amounts reduce confusion. The plan only works if it is realistic. The pattern in what happens if rent is late is easier to handle when the first signal is noticed instead of dismissed. The situation is easier to judge when the plan only works if it is realistic is treated as a likely effect, not a mystery. Late rent becomes easier to manage when records are clear. Consider the moment when legal rules vary by location. Notice periods, fees, and eviction steps are not identical everywhere. Tenants should not rely on generic assumptions. The answer in what happens if rent is late is usually found in the cause, not in the label people attach afterward. A person who catches this early can respond before tenants should not rely on generic assumptions becomes harder to reverse. Late rent requires a specific next step rather than a vague hope. What happens if rent is late becomes clearer when catching up requires confirming the account is current. Paying the old balance may not include fees or new rent. A written zero balance confirmation avoids later surprise. Once the cause is named in what happens if rent is late, the response can fit the situation more closely. For what happens if rent is late, the real sequence matters more than the most dramatic detail. Late rent matters because the result is felt in daily life. In what happens if rent is late, notice when late rent is best handled before fear turns into avoidance. Fast communication, proof of payment, and a realistic plan can protect housing. Waiting usually gives the problem more power. The link between those pieces is what makes what happens if rent is late useful in real life. That difference matters because waiting usually gives the problem more power is often where the pain or cost is felt.